Today, I will try to suggest that there is more in the Talmud that might look Christian to us. What we have become accustomed in the last 1,500 years, 1,600 years, to think of as a total binary opposition, Christianity and Judaism, is actually a much more complicated relation. That many of the things that we thought belong exclusively on one side of the line, exclusively on the other side of the line, really do not actually form the basis for such an absolute binary opposition. In fact, I will suggest, and I do suggest, that there is no single distinguishing mark that would absolutely distinguish between Judaism and Christianity. Katuv echad omer. Right? One verse says, "Levushei kitlag chivar usa'ar reshei ke'amar nakei. Uktiv kfutzotav taltalim shchorot ke'orev." One verse says, a verse in Daniel, says, his garment, we're talking of course about the Kodesh Baruch Hu, about God, his garment is like white snow, and the hair of his head is like the wool of a sheep. But another verse says, in Shir HaShirim, in the Song of Songs, that his curls, the curls of his hair, are black like a raven. So we have a contradiction. One verse says that God's hair is white, and one verse says that God's hair is black. Of course, I don't have to ask a rhetorical question. Black hair belongs to young people, except in some cases, but most cases, black hair belongs to young people. And white hair, like mine, belongs to old men, right? So the suggestion is that there's a contradiction because God is being described in one verse as an old man and in another verse as a very young man. Now you can imagine that the rabbis were very sensitive about the suggestion that there might be a young God and an old God. And this, in other words, what I'm saying is this is not only a formal contradiction, but there's a real threat here. Remember, this text is probably from the 4th or the 5th century already. There's a real threat in the suggestion that these two verses describe two different, shall we say, persons of God. So the Gemara says, La kashya, there's no difficulty, kan b'yeshiva, kan b'milchama. There's no difficulty. One is sitting, and sitting here means sitting as a judge. In English we say he is sitting means he is judging, also in Hebrew. And one is at war, during war. De'amar mar, ein lecha na'eh b'yeshiva ela zaken, ve'ein lecha na'eh b'milchama ela bachur. What I want to suggest is that, which I've already begun to suggest earlier, but I want to explore this idea a little more, and then I'm going to develop it further, that this text is not innocent. It's not historically innocent. It's not simply a consideration of a difficulty that one verse says this way, another verse says that way, but that it is on the background of a kind of a polemic. Because, of course, there were a very important group of people in the world of Chazal, who were claiming exactly that there is an old God and a young God. Now, of course, I'm not going into all the details. Of course, Christians didn't think that really they were two gods. But they used verses like this. We actually have the evidence that Christian writers used verses like this, or collections of verses like this, to argue against those Jews who had rejected Christian ideas, that there really are two persons. And we find many examples of this. So let's go on, read the next paragraph. Katuv echad omer, the same form, one verse says, Kursei shvivim dinur וכתוב אחד אומר, עד די קורסבן רמיו, ועתיק יומין יטיף. So one verse says, his chair was sparks of fire, his chair in the singular. The other verse says, until chairs were set up, and the Ancient of Days sat. Once again, it looks like we have a purely formal contradiction. But if we think about what I said just a few minutes ago, we can see that this is again a very, very threatening idea. It's a very threatening idea. What are two thrones up there if there's only one God? And again, I want to emphasize, these are real arguments that Christian writers used to prove that there was the Father and the Son, that there was a doubleness in Godhead. But we're in for a real surprise. Because the Talmud answers, it says, La kashya, again, there is no difficulty, echad lo ve'echad leDavid. So we've got two thrones, one, atik yomin, the Ancient of Days is sitting on, and who's sitting on the other one? David. It seems like a very elegant and easy solution. But when we think about it, we'll see that this solution itself actually is full of chomer nefetz. First of all, if David is sitting up there all the time, right? If David HaMelech is sitting up there all the time next to the right hand of God, so what is he? I mean, there aren't people sitting up there. Secondly, I'm sure you all know the book of Daniel by heart, but just in case I will remind myself. Secondly, who is that second throne for in the book of Daniel? In the book of Daniel, it tells us that the two thrones were set up, and the Atik Yomin, the Ancient of Days, right, the old God, like the old professor, sat on one, and then it says, there came one, kivar nasha, like a son of man, literally, and came to the old God, and the old God sat the young one down onto the second throne. Now there's no question that in the book of Daniel, the one like a son of man is understood as a divine figure, as God, as a divinity, let's say, which is quite amazing, of course. So if, follow my logic, it's good, perfect Talmudic logic, if the one who is sitting on the second kisei, on the second throne, is the Son of Man, and if, according to the Talmud, the one who's sitting on the second throne is David HaMelech, then who is David HaMelech? In other words, David HaMelech, if the Son of Man is a divine figure, and I'm going to give you one absolute proof of that in just a minute, and if David HaMelech is that same figure, then David HaMelech, as the Mashiach who will come, is a combination, some kind of a combination, and we didn't spend the 4th century trying to figure out, so we'll just leave it open, right? Some kind of a combination of a human being, David HaMelech, and a divine figure. Now, how do I know that the one like a son of man is an actual image of a god or a godlike figure? Because it says he came on the clouds of the heaven. And there are 70 places in the Tanakh where someone comes on the clouds of the heaven, and in every single one of them, it is God who comes on the clouds of heaven. So we come to the absolutely astonishing conclusion, the absolutely astonishing suggestion, that the Talmud here comprehends the possibility, at least, that the Mashiach, Christos, right? Greek is, Mashiach is just Christos in Greek, means the same thing, that the Mashiach is a combination of a human being and a divine person who is sitting at the right hand. I throw in the right hand. It could have been on the left hand, but since we know from the verse in Psalms that it was the right hand, who is sitting at the right hand of the Father, waiting, of course, to be sent down to earth. There's another surprise coming, because the Talmud says, Kidetanya, Echad lo ve'echad David, divrei Rabbi Akiva. So no lesser a figure than Rabbi Akiva himself. The great Rabbi Akiva is represented in this passage in the Talmud as believing that on the second throne is sitting David HaMelech, who is the Son of Man. Of course, the Gemara can't leave it at that. Amar lo Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Akiva, ad matai ata oseh shchina chol, ele achad ledin ve'achad letzedakah. Listen what Rabbi Yossi Aglili is saying. He understands that the one sitting on the second throne is the Shekhinah, right? The Shekhinah is the part of God who is present on earth. But he says, Ad matai ata oseh shchina chol. He says, how long, Akiva, are you going to say that the Shekhinah is profane? What does it mean that the Shekhinah is profane? That the Shekhinah could be incarnated in a human being. The theological idea that the Mashiach is divine, godly, and that the Mashiach Shekhinah yechol, that God will become a human being, kivar nasha, in order to be the Redeemer of the world, in order to be the Mashiach, is, according to this, is the view of no less than Rabbi Akiva. What we have here, I think, is a recognition by the Talmud itself that the idea, that these ideas, these apocalyptic ideas, which I insist are to be found in the book of Daniel, and I'll mention in a few minutes other places that they can be found, places that are absolutely without any question Jewish texts, are inside Judaism, even inside the rabbinic community. By putting this into the mouth of Rabbi Akiva, they're saying, we know that these ideas are not something that comes from outside, but something that comes from inside. When Rabbi Yossi Aglili says to Rabbi Akiva, Ad matai ata oseh shchina chol, he is saying, Rabbi Akiva, you sound a lot like a Christian. Because after all, that is Christian doctrine, that God became human in order to save humans, right? That God became human so that humans could become God. That's the classic Orthodox formulation. So, let me pull some things together. The book of Daniel belongs to the apocalyptic tradition. It is, in fact, arguably the oldest apocalypse. Within the apocalyptic tradition, and I'm talking about the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, because there weren't any Christians yet. Daniel is from the 3rd century BC. Right, before Christ. Within that apocalyptic imagination, and I think this is very, very, very ancient, but I'm not going to explore that with you today. I've published on this, but I think it's very ancient. The idea is that at the time of the redemption, God, the old God, the far God, the important thing is that God is the very far God, transcendent, will transfer power, delegate power to a younger divine figure who will then come down to earth, rule the earth, and save the world. And this is the story that we're told in Daniel 7:13. The Atik Yomin is sitting on one chair, the one like a son of man, the young one is brought to him, and he gives him shultan in Aramaic, which is exousia in Greek, or sovereignty. He makes the young God sovereign over the earth and everything on the earth till the end of time. We find the same idea in 2 other books. which are not in any way connected with Christianity. One is the book of Hanoch, and the other is the book of 4th Ezra. The astonishing thing that I think it's been here in the Talmud all along, but I don't think anybody until now had the chutzpah to say it. The amazing thing is that we have evidence here that the rabbis themselves recognized that this idea continued to be held by good Jewish boys like Rabbi Akiva well into the rabbinic period, that is hundreds of years after Christianity came into the world. The bottom line, the unterste Shura, as we say in Yiddish, the bottom line is that on this theological level, I think one can suggest, and there's more evidence, that the Christian theology of the Father and the Son as Redeemer, and even the incarnation is one strand of ancient Judaism. So we have a direct traditional line from the book of Enoch, from the 3rd century before Christ, to the Talmud in the 5th, 6th century after Christ, a Jewish tradition that there is a second divine figure, that he is Enoch. We saw Rabbi Akiva said it's even David HaMelech, who is sitting in heaven next to the Kodesh Baruch Hu and defending Israel, or is going to be the Mashiach that will save not only Israel but the whole world. The distinction between what we call Judaism and what we call Christianity is not theological, but it has to do with the identification of who the Mashiach is. Those whom we call Jews decided that Jesus was not the Mashiach. Those whom we call Christians had concluded that Jesus was the Mashiach.